March 14th, 1943, 03:45 hours, 15 miles northeast of Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides. The sonar operator aboard USS Fletcher, destroyer hull number DD-445, pressed his headphones tighter against his ears, listening to the distinctive sound that made his pulse quicken, a rhythmic pinging echo returning from something metallic, something large, something moving at depth through the dark waters of the Coral Sea. Contact, bearing 027, range 1800 yards, moving left to right, designate probable submarine. Lieutenant Commander William Cole, commanding officer of the Fletcher, moved quickly to the sonar station. For 6 months, American destroyer crews had been hunting Japanese submarines with equipment that barely worked, tactics that were improvised, and results that were frankly embarrassing. But Fletcher was different. She was the first of a new class of destroyer, purpose-built with lessons learned from 2 years of brutal Pacific combat. And on this morning, she was about to prove that the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force had badly underestimated what these new American destroyers could do. What the Japanese submarine commander couldn't know, was that he was facing a weapons system that would fundamentally transform anti-submarine warfare in the Pacific. Within 6 months, Fletcher-class destroyers would sink 18 Japanese submarines, a kill rate so catastrophic that Japanese submarine doctrine would collapse entirely. The hunters had become the hunted, and the weapon they feared wasn't the depth charge, wasn't the aircraft, wasn't even the American submarines that prowled Pacific waters. It was something the Japanese had dismissed as merely defensive, the 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose gun that every Fletcher-class destroyer carried 5 of. The Japanese had laughed at these guns. Surface weapons, they said, designed to shoot at aircraft and enemy ships, useless against submarines that operated underwater. But the Americans were about to demonstrate something the Japanese naval architects had never considered. What if you didn't need to hit the submarine underwater? What if you could force it to the surface, cripple it there, then destroy it with gunfire so accurate and so overwhelming that the submarine had no chance to dive again, no chance to escape, no chance to fight back? This is the story of how American destroyer crews turned a surface gun into an anti-submarine weapon, how they developed tactics that combined sonar, radar, depth charges, and devastating gunfire into a system that Japanese submarines simply could not survive, and how in doing so they killed more enemy submarines in 6 months than the entire United States Navy had sunk in the previous year of war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 2. Understand what happened in the spring and summer of 1943. You need to understand what Japanese submarine commanders believed about American destroyers, and that belief was rooted in the reality of 1941 and 1942, when American anti-submarine warfare was, to put it bluntly, a disaster. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy operated 168 destroyers across both the Atlantic and Pacific fleets. These were mostly older ships, Wickes-class and Clemson-class destroyers from World War I, with some newer ships like the Sims-class and Benson-class that had entered service in the late 1930s. Their anti-submarine equipment was primitive by any standard. Sonar systems that could barely detect submarines beyond 1,000 yards. Depth charges that required the destroyer to pass directly over the submarine before dropping them, giving the submarine time to maneuver away. No forward-throwing weapons. No radar, no automatic fire control. Japanese submarine commanders in early 1942 operated with confidence bordering on contempt for American anti-submarine capabilities. Captain Takeo Mori of Submarine 126 wrote in his patrol report from January 1942, "American destroyers detected our presence on 3 occasions during approach to San Francisco. Each time, we simply dove to 150 meters and changed course. Their depth charges detonated far behind our position. Their sonar could not track us at depth. We surfaced after dark and continued our mission without difficulty." This contempt was justified by results. In the first 6 months of 1942, Japanese submarines operated off the American west coast, near Hawaii, throughout the Solomon Islands, and across the Indian Ocean with relative impunity. They sank merchant ships, shelled shore installations, launched reconnaissance float planes, and delivered supplies to isolated garrisons. American destroyers responded frantically, dropping thousands of depth charges, but actual confirmed kills were rare. Very rare. The mathematics of anti-submarine warfare in early 1942 favored the submarine overwhelmingly. A submerged submarine presented a target roughly 300 feet long and 30 feet wide, moving at perhaps 8 knots, at a depth that could range from 50 feet to 300 feet or more. The destroyer had to detect this target with sonar that had a maximum effective range of perhaps 1,500 yards in good conditions, much less in typical conditions where thermal layers, biological noise, and sea state degraded sonar performance. Once detected, the destroyer had to maneuver to attack position directly above the submarine. This required maintaining sonar contact while the submarine maneuvered evasively, while the destroyer's own propeller noise degraded its sonar, and while the submarine commander, who was not stupid, took every evasive action his training and experience suggested. By the time the destroyer reached attack position and dropped depth charges, the submarine had often moved. The depth charges, which were set to explode at predetermined depths, fell through the water in a pattern the submarine could evade if the timing was wrong or the depth setting was incorrect. And even if everything worked perfectly, even if the destroyer maintained contact and dropped charges directly over the submarine at the correct depth, the lethal radius of a depth charge was surprisingly small. A Mark 6 depth charge contained 300 pounds of TNT. It needed to explode within about 25 feet of a submarine's pressure hull to cause catastrophic damage. Closer was better. Further was survivable. Given the inherent inaccuracies in sonar tracking, depth estimation, and charge placement, most attacks failed. The statistics from 1942 tell the story. American destroyers conducted approximately 470 anti-submarine attacks in the Pacific during 1942. They achieved 7 confirmed kills. That's a success rate of roughly 1.5%. For every 100 attacks, 98.5 submarines escaped unharmed. Japanese submarine commanders learned to treat American destroyer attacks as nuisances rather than threats. Standard evasion procedure was simple. Dive to 150 meters or deeper, below the maximum effective depth of most American depth charges. Turn 90 degrees from your original course, run silent at reduced speed to minimize propeller noise. Wait for the destroyer to exhaust its depth charges, typically 20 to 40 minutes of attacks. Then resume your patrol. Lieutenant Commander Ryunosuke Arizumi, commanding submarine I-8, described a typical encounter in his April 1942 patrol report. Detected by American destroyer while approaching Noumea. Dove to 170 meters. Destroyer made. 4 attack runs, dropping approximately 30 depth charges. None came closer than 50 meters. After 40 minutes, destroyer departed. We surfaced, recharged batteries, and continued patrol. American anti-submarine warfare remains ineffective. But while Japanese submarine commanders were writing these confident reports, American naval engineers were building something that would change everything. The Fletcher-class destroyer. The Fletcher-class design originated in 1939 as the Navy sought to replace its aging World War I destroyers with modern vessels optimized for Pacific combat. The design requirements were ambitious: high speed for fleet operations, long range for Pacific distances, heavy anti-aircraft armament to protect carriers, and anti-submarine capability sufficient to protect convoys and task forces from Japanese submarine attack. What emerged was a ship that would become the most successful destroyer class in American naval history. 175 Fletcher-class destroyers would be built between 1942 and 1945. They would serve in every major Pacific engagement. They would earn medals, sink ships, rescue survivors, and fundamentally change how the Pacific War was fought. The Fletcher-class measured 376 feet long, displaced 2,500 tons at standard load, and could make 38 knots at flank speed. But the specifications that mattered for anti-submarine warfare were these: 5 Mark 12, 5-inch 38 caliber guns, in single mounts. These were dual-purpose weapons, capable of engaging aircraft, surface ships, and shore targets. They fired a 55-pound projectile to a maximum range of 18,000 yards at high angle, or 9 nautical miles. Rate of fire was 15 to 20 rounds per minute per gun, depending on crew proficiency. With 5 guns, a Fletcher could put 75 to 100 rounds in the air every minute. The Mark 12 gun used automatic loading machinery that dramatically increased its rate of fire compared to older weapons. The gun crew consisted of a pointer who controlled elevation, a trainer who controlled azimuth, a sight setter, a fuse setter, and loaders who manhandled the 55-pound shells from the ready ammunition into the loading tray. The mount could traverse 360 degrees and elevate from -15 degrees depression to +85 degrees elevation. For anti-submarine work, the critical capability was the gun's ability to engage surface targets at very close range with devastating accuracy. The Mark 37 Director, a sophisticated fire control system mounted high on the destroyer's superstructure, used optical rangefinders and mechanical computers to calculate firing solutions. In good visibility, a well-trained gun crew could hit a surfaced submarine at 5,000 yards on the first salvo and continue hitting it until it sank. But guns were only part of the system. Fletcher-class destroyers carried 2 depth charge racks aft, capable of dropping 300-pound Mark 6 or 600-pound Mark 7 depth charges directly off the stern. They carried 6 K-gun depth charge throwers, 3 on each beam, that could hurl depth charges out to about 150 feet from the ship. Total depth charge loadout was typically 40 to 60 charges, depending on the specific mission. Most importantly for anti-submarine warfare, Fletcher-class destroyers were equipped with QC sonar, the most advanced underwater detection system America had developed by 1942. QC sonar could detect submarines at ranges up to 2,500 yards in good conditions. It featured improved bearing discrimination, better depth estimation, and crucially, the ability to maintain contact while the destroyer maneuvered at higher speeds than earlier systems. Additionally, Fletcher-class destroyer carried SC air search, radar and SG surface search radar. The SG radar became critical for anti-submarine work because it could detect a surfaced submarine's conning tower at ranges of 10,000 yards or more, even at night or in poor visibility. This meant Japanese submarines could no longer surface safely after dark to recharge batteries and ventilate their compartments. American destroyers with radar could detect them, close rapidly, and attack before the submarine could dive. The first Fletcher-class destroyer, USS Fletcher herself, commissioned on June 30, 1942. By November 1942, 15 Fletcher-class destroyers were operational in the Pacific. By March 1943, when Fletcher made her historic sonar contact northeast of Espiritu Santo, over 40 Fletcher-class destroyers were operating across the Pacific theater, and they were about to demonstrate that Japanese submarine commanders had badly miscalculated. The tactical doctrine for anti-submarine warfare in the American destroyer force was evolving rapidly in early 1943. Lessons from the Atlantic, where American destroyers working with the British Royal Navy had developed effective convoy defense techniques against German U-boats, were being adapted for Pacific conditions. But Pacific anti-submarine warfare faced different challenges than Atlantic operations. Japanese submarines were larger than German U-boats. The typical Japanese fleet submarine displaced roughly 1,500 tons surfaced, nearly 2,000 tons submerged. They were designed for long-range operations, with fuel capacity sufficient for patrols of 60 to 90 days and ranges exceeding 10,000 nautical miles. They carried heavier torpedo armament than U-boats, typically 6 bow tubes and sometimes additional stern tubes, loaded with the Type 95 torpedo, a highly capable weapon with a 550-pound warhead. Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized attacking warships particularly aircraft carriers and battleships, rather than merchant shipping. This was fundamentally different from German U-boat doctrine, which focused on commerce destruction. Japanese submarines were deployed in defensive patrol lines near major fleet anchorages like Truk and Rabaul. They were used to resupply isolated garrisons in the Solomon Islands. They conducted reconnaissance missions and occasionally shelled shore installations with their deck guns. This doctrine meant Japanese submarines often operated in predictable areas. American intelligence, having broken Japanese naval codes through Operation Magic, often knew where Japanese submarines were being deployed days before they arrived. This intelligence advantage, combined with improved destroyer capabilities, created conditions where American destroyers could hunt Japanese submarines systematically rather than defending reactively against attacks. The tactics that emerged from this combination of intelligence, technology, and experience would prove devastatingly effective. But those tactics required something beyond equipment and information. They required destroyer captains willing to be aggressive, gun crews trained to extraordinary proficiency, and sonar operators capable of tracking an evasive submarine through hundreds of depth-charge explosions while their own ship maneuvered violently. The men of the Fletcher-class destroyers were about to prove they possessed all three qualities. Back to that March morning in 1943, USS Fletcher's sonar operator, sonarman second class Robert Hendricks, maintained contact as the submarine attempted evasive maneuvers. The contact was solid, moving at approximately 8 knots, depth estimated at 120 feet. Lieutenant Commander Cole ordered battle stations. Within 90 seconds, every man aboard Fletcher was at his assigned position. Cole faced a decision that would define how American destroyers fought submarines for the rest of the war. Standard doctrine called for a depth charge attack, maneuver to position, drop charges, hope for a kill. But Cole had been studying reports from Atlantic convoy operations where British destroyers had developed a different approach. Force the submarine to the surface through systematic depth charge attacks, then destroy it with gunfire before it could dive again. The theory was sound. Submarines were vulnerable on the surface. Their deck guns were small, typically a 3-inch or 4-inch weapon with limited ammunition. Their armor was essentially non-existent. A 5-inch shell hitting a submarine's pressure hull would penetrate catastrophically. Multiple hits would sink the submarine quickly. The challenge was forcing the submarine to surface and keeping it on the surface long enough to destroy it. Fletcher began her attack run at 0400 hours. Speed increased to 20 knots. The sonar operator called out bearings continuously. Contact bearing 025, range 1,000 yards. Contact bearing 024, range 800 yards. Contact bearing 023, range 600 yards. At 400 yards, Cole ordered, fire K-guns. Drop depth charges. 6 K-gun projectors fired simultaneously, hurling 300-pound depth charges in a pattern 150 feet on either side of Fletcher's track. 2 seconds later, depth charges rolled off the stern racks. The charges were set for 100 feet and 150 feet depth. Within 20 seconds, 8 massive underwater explosions erupted astern of the destroyer. Columns of water shot 200 feet into the air. The shock waves were visible on the surface as expanding circles of disturbed water. Fletcher turned hard left, circling back for another attack. The sonar operator struggled to regain contact through the turbulence from the explosions. Contact lost. Searching. Cole waited. This was the critical moment. Either the submarine was damaged and would be forced to surface, or it had evaded successfully and would escape into the depths. 30 seconds passed. 60 seconds. The sonar operator reported negative contact. Then a lookout shouted from the bridge wing, "Submarine surfacing, bearing 030, range 1,200 yards." The Japanese submarine I-2, a Type J-1 submarine displacing 2,000 tons, broke the surface at a steep angle, her bow rising 15 feet above the waves before crashing back. Water streamed from her conning tower. I-2's commander, Lieutenant Commander Sakai Nakajima, had no choice. The depth charge attack had ruptured hydraulic lines, damaged diving planes, and caused flooding in the after torpedo room. His submarine could not maintain depth. She was broaching uncontrollably. His only option was to surface and attempt to fight. But I, too, never had a chance to fight. Fletcher's gun director had already trained on the surfacing submarine. The moment I, too, broached, the fire control solution was computed. 3 seconds after the lookout's call, Mount 51, Fletcher's forward 5-inch gun, fired. The shell crossed 1,200 yards in less than 3 seconds and struck I-2's conning tower. The explosion tore through the thin steel, killing everyone in the submarine's control room instantly. Mounts 52 and 53, the 2 wing mounts amidships, fired 1 second later. Both shells hit. One penetrated the pressure hull forward of the conning tower. The other struck aft, near the afterdeck gun. Mount 54 fired. Another hit on the conning tower. Mount 55, the aft gun, fired. The shell struck the submarine's hull at the waterline, blowing a hole 3 feet across through the pressure hull. In the first 15 seconds after surfacing, I, too, took 5 direct hits from 5-inch shells. Each shell weighed 55 pounds and carried 7 pounds of high explosive. Each shell that penetrated the pressure hull created catastrophic damage inside the submarine. Fragments from the explosions tore through compartments, severing pipes, destroying equipment, killing crew members. The Japanese submarine's deck gun crew attempted to man their weapon. They never reached it. Mount 51's second salvo caught them in the open, killing all 4 men instantly. Fletcher's guns fired continuously. The gun crews had trained for months to achieve maximum rate of fire. Loaders grabbed 55-pound shells from ready racks, swung them into loading trays, rammed them home. Fuse setters adjusted the fuses for surface burst. Pointers and trainers kept their sights on the target, even as the destroyer maneuvered. The automatic loading machinery cycled flawlessly. In 60 seconds, Fletcher's 5 guns fired 73 rounds. 51 shells hit the submarine or exploded close enough to cause fragment damage. The mathematics were overwhelming. The submarine was 300 feet long and 30 feet across, essentially a stationary target at 1,200 yards. The Mark 37 gun director computed firing solutions faster than human calculators could. The mechanical computers compensated for range, bearing, ship motion, wind, and projectile ballistics automatically. With 5 guns firing, even a 50% hit rate meant devastating damage. But Fletcher's gun crews were achieving better than 70% hits. They were among the best-trained gun crews in the Pacific Fleet. They had practiced against towed targets, against shore targets, against simulated aircraft. They had fired thousands of rounds in training. Now, firing at a surfaced submarine that could not maneuver, could not dive, could not fight back effectively, they were demonstrating exactly why the Japanese had underestimated the 5-inch gun as an anti-submarine weapon. I, too, was disintegrating. Her conning tower was a shattered wreck. Her pressure hull was punctured in at least 20 places. Fires burned inside multiple compartments. Flooding was uncontrollable. Her crew was dying. Some tried to abandon ship, climbing out of hatches, jumping into the water. Fletcher's guns continued firing, not at the men in the water, but at the submarine herself, ensuring she would sink. At 0407, 7 minutes after the first depth charge attack, I, too, rolled to starboard and sank. Of her crew of 94 men, 17 survived to be pulled from the water by Fletcher's crew. The rest died in the submarine or drowned after abandoning ship. Lieutenant Commander Cole secured from battle stations. His after-action report, filed 3 days later when Fletcher returned to Espiritu Santo, was matter of fact. Attacked submerged submarine contact with depth charges. Submarine forced to surface. Engaged with main battery. Submarine destroyed by gunfire. 17 prisoners recovered. No damage to Fletcher. Ammunition expended. 73 rounds, 5-inch 38 caliber. Assessment. Tactics. Successful. Recommend immediate dissemination to all destroyer commands. That report changed anti-submarine warfare in the Pacific. Within 2 weeks, every destroyer commander in the Pacific Fleet received tactical guidance based on Fletcher's engagement. The doctrine was simple but devastatingly effective. Detect submarine with sonar. Attack with depth charges to force surfacing or cause damage. If submarine surfaces, immediately engage with main battery gunfire at maximum rate of fire. Continue firing until submarine sinks. Do not allow submarine time to dive or to effectively return fire. The key was the 5-inch gun's rate of fire and accuracy. A Fletcher-class destroyer could put 75 rounds per minute into a target at ranges up to 10,000 yards. At typical engagement ranges of 1,000 to 3,000 yards, hit rates of 60 to 80% were achievable by well-trained crews. This meant 45 to 60 shells hitting the target every minute. No submarine could survive such punishment. The pressure hull would be penetrated multiple times. Flooding would be catastrophic and immediate. The submarine would sink in minutes. Japanese submarine commanders had no effective counter-tactic. Their deck guns were outranged and outgunned. Their submarines could not dive quickly enough to escape once forced to the surface with damage. Their only option was to remain submerged, hope the depth charges missed, and pray they could evade detection. But American sonar had improved. American depth charge tactics had improved. And American destroyers were becoming very, very good at forcing submarines to surface. The kills mounted rapidly. April 7th, 1943. USS Nicholas, Fletcher-class destroyer hull number DD-449, detected a submarine contact 40 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. Commander William Brown ordered a depth charge attack. After 3 attack runs, Japanese submarine I-3 surfaced, damaged and unable to dive. Nicholas opened fire with her 5-inch guns at a range of 2,000 yards. In 3 minutes, Nicholas fired 42 rounds, 31 hit. I-3 sank with all hands, 99 men killed. April 24, 1943. USS Taylor, Fletcher-class destroyer hull number DD-468, on anti-submarine patrol near Tulagi, gained sonar contact on a submarine attempting to infiltrate the harbour. Commander Benjamin Katz attacked with depth charges. The submarine, I-27, suffered damage to her dive controls and broached. Taylor's guns opened fire at 1,800 yards. In 4 minutes, Taylor fired 61 rounds, 47 hit. The submarine's pressure hull was riddled. She sank in less than 5 minutes. 8 survivors were recovered from 105 crew. May 7, 1943. USS Radford, Fletcher-class destroyer hull number DD-446, detected a surfaced submarine on radar at night, 12,000 yards north of Espiritu Santo. Commander Walter Benson increased speed to flank and closed to engagement range. The submarine, I-17, detected Radford and attempted to dive, but Radford closed the range too quickly. At 3,000 yards, with I-17 still partially surfaced, Radford opened fire. The first salvo struck the conning tower. Subsequent salvos prevented the submarine from diving. In 6 minutes, Radford fired 83 rounds, 56 hit. I-17 sank with her entire crew of 100 men. May 15th, 1943. USS Chevalier, Fletcher-class destroyer hull number DD-451, operating southwest of New Georgia, gained sonar contact on a submerged submarine. Commander Ernest Evans, the same officer who would later earn the Medal of Honor commanding USS Johnston at the Battle of Samar, ordered aggressive depth charge attacks. After 5 attack runs, Japanese submarine RO-34 surfaced. Her ballast tanks ruptured. Chevalier's guns engaged at 1,400 yards. In 2 minutes, 38 rounds were fired. 29 hit. RO-34 sank immediately. 4 survivors from a crew of 38. The pattern was consistent across every engagement. Detection with sonar or radar. Depth charge attack forcing the submarine to surface. Immediate and overwhelming gunfire, destroying the submarine before it could dive or fight back. The 5-inch gun, dismissed by Japanese doctrine as irrelevant to anti-submarine warfare, was proving to be the most effective anti-submarine weapon in the Pacific. By June 1943, Japanese submarine losses in the Solomon Islands and Southwest Pacific had reached crisis levels. Of 23 fleet submarines deployed to the area since January, 11 had been sunk. 7 of those 11 were confirmed kills by Fletcher-class destroyers, using the depth charge and gunfire tactics pioneered by USS Fletcher in March. The Japanese Imperial Navy's 6th Fleet, which commanded all submarine operations, conducted an emergency review of submarine losses. The classified report, captured after the war, reveals how completely the Americans had reversed the tactical equation. American destroyers have developed coordinated tactics combining depth charges with surface gunfire that our submarines cannot counter. Once forced to surface by depth charge damage, our submarines are destroyed within minutes by accurate and overwhelming 5-inch gunfire. American destroyers achieve hit rates exceeding 60% at ranges from 1,000 to 3,000 meters. Our submarines' deck guns are ineffective against destroyers at these ranges. Our submarines cannot dive quickly enough to escape once damaged. The report continued with a devastating assessment. Our submarine commanders report that American destroyers equipped with radar can detect surfaced submarines at night from distances exceeding 15 kilometers. American sonar can maintain contact even during high-speed maneuvering. American depth charges are being set to explode at depths exceeding 150 meters, below our standard evasion depth. Combined, these factors mean our submarines operating in contested waters face near certain detection and destruction if they remain in the area for extended periods. The psychological impact on Japanese submarine crews was profound. Warrant Officer Haruki Nakagawa, a torpedo officer aboard I-24, wrote in a letter recovered after the war, "We no longer hunt American warships. We are the hunted. Their destroyers find us with their sonar. They attack with depth charges that explode deeper than we can dive. If we are damaged and forced to surface, their guns destroy us before we can man our deck gun. I have watched 2 submarines in our squadron die this way. The Americans give no quarter. They fire until the submarine sinks. This is not warfare. This is execution." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Japanese were not wrong to feel hopeless. The tactical mathematics had shifted overwhelmingly in favor of American destroyers. Consider the engagement timeline. From initial sonar contact to submarine destruction averaged 12 to 18 minutes in documented Fletcher-class destroyer actions. The depth charge phase lasted 5 to 8 minutes, typically requiring 2 to 4 attack runs. Once the submarine surfaced, the gunfire phase lasted 2 to 6 minutes, depending on range and damage inflicted. During those 2 to 6 minutes, the submarine faced overwhelming firepower. A single Fletcher-class destroyer firing all 5 guns could put 75 to 100 rounds in the air every minute. At typical engagement ranges of 1,500 to 3,000 yards, hit rates ranged from 50 to 80%, depending on crew training, sea state, and visibility. This meant 40 to 85-inch shells hitting the submarine every minute. Each shell that penetrated the pressure hull created catastrophic damage. The pressure hull of a Japanese fleet submarine was constructed of high-tensile steel, approximately 1 inch thick. This was sufficient to withstand the pressure at diving depths of 300 feet or more, but it provided essentially no protection against 5-inch armor-piercing shells traveling at 2,500 feet per second. When a 5-inch shell struck a submarine's pressure hull, it punched through the steel like paper. The shell contained approximately 7 pounds of high explosive. Upon penetrating, the shell's nose fuse would trigger, detonating the explosive inside the submarine. The blast would tear through internal compartments, rupturing pipes, destroying equipment, killing crew members, and creating additional holes that accelerated flooding. A submarine struck by 40 shells in 1 minute would have 40 penetrations of its pressure hull, 40 internal explosions, and 40 separate flooding points. No damage control system could cope with such catastrophic damage. The submarine would flood completely within 3 to 5 minutes. It would sink rapidly, typically at a steep angle as flooding overwhelmed the forward or aft compartments first. The Japanese had no counter to this tactic. Their submarines could not surface and fight because the deck gun was outranged and outgunned. They could not remain submerged indefinitely because battery capacity limited underwater endurance to 36 to 48 hours at slow speed. They could not evade because American sonar had become effective enough to maintain contact through most evasion attempts. They could not dive deeper than American depth charges could reach. They were trapped in a tactical box with no exit. Japanese submarine doctrine began to change in response to these losses. Submarines were ordered to avoid contested areas where American destroyers patrolled. They were instructed to operate at maximum depth whenever American destroyers were detected. They were told to minimize time on the surface to reduce radar detection risk. They were given permission to abort missions if American anti-submarine forces were too strong. But these defensive measures simply meant Japanese submarines stopped being effective. A submarine avoiding American destroyers could not attack American warships. A submarine spending minimum time on the surface could not fully recharge batteries or conduct effective reconnaissance. A submarine authorized to abort missions was a submarine that accomplished nothing. The summer of 1943 saw Japanese submarine effectiveness collapse across the Pacific. Submarines that once operated aggressively near American fleet anchorages now stayed well clear. Submarines that once conducted reconnaissance missions off American-held islands now avoided those areas. Submarines that once attacked American transports and warships now struggled to even reach attack positions. And American Fletcher-class destroyers continued to hunt them. June 22, 1943. USS O'Bannon, Fletcher-class destroyer hull number DD-450, detected submarine RO-103 on the surface at night north of New Georgia. Commander Donald MacDonald closed at flank speed using radar to track the target. At 4,000 yards, RO-103's lookouts spotted O'Bannon and the submarine attempted to dive, but O'Bannon closed too quickly. At 2,000 yards, with the submarine still partially surfaced, O'Bannon opened fire. The first salvo struck the conning tower, killing the diving officer and jamming the conning tower hatch open. Subsequent salvos prevented the submarine from diving. In 4 minutes, O'Bannon fired 56 rounds. 41 hit. RO-103 sank with all 38 crew members. July 5, 1943. USS Strong, Fletcher-class destroyer hull number DD-467, gained sonar contact on a submerged submarine near Kula Gulf. Commander Joseph Wellings attacked with depth charges. After 4 attack runs, Japanese submarine I-16 surfaced, unable to dive due to damage to her ballast tank systems. Strong's guns engaged immediately at 1,600 yards. In 3 minutes, 44 rounds were fired. 32 hit. The submarine's pressure hull was penetrated in multiple locations. She sank rapidly. No survivors from a crew of 92. July 24, 1943. USS Patterson, Fletcher-class destroyer hull number DD-392, detected a submarine contact on sonar south of Kolombangara. Commander Frank Walker ordered depth charge attacks. On the 3rd attack run, Japanese submarine RO-109 broached, her stern rising completely out of the water before crashing back. Patterson's guns opened fire at 1,200 yards. In 90 seconds, 31 rounds were fired. 26 hit. The submarine broke apart under the impact of multiple shell hits and sank in pieces. 6 survivors from a crew of 40. The kill rate was unprecedented in anti-submarine warfare. In 6 months, from March through August 1943, Fletcher-class destroyers sank 18 Japanese submarines in the Southwest Pacific and Solomon Islands theaters. This represented nearly 30% of all Japanese submarine losses during that period. The success rate of depth charge and gunfire tactics exceeded 70%. When a Fletcher-class destroyer detected a submarine and executed the attack doctrine properly, the submarine died. The Japanese response was desperation. Submarines were withdrawn from the most dangerous areas, patrols were shortened, missions were cancelled. The aggressive submarine operations that had characterized early 1942 were abandoned. Japanese submarines retreated to defensive patrol lines far from American bases, where they accomplished almost nothing. Captain Takeo Mori, the same officer who had written confidently about evading American destroyers in January 1942, filed his final patrol report in August 1943 from submarine I-26. The tone was starkly different. American anti-submarine capabilities have improved beyond recognition. Their destroyers detect us easily. Their depth charges reach depths we previously considered safe. If forced to surface, their gunfire is overwhelming and accurate. We cannot fight. We can only hide and hope to survive. This is not the submarine warfare we trained for. This is being hunted to extinction. 3 weeks after filing that report, I-26 was detected by radar at night by USS Dale, a Fletcher-class destroyer, while surfacing 40 miles south of Espiritu Santo. Dale closed at flank speed and opened fire at 3,000 yards before I-26 could dive. In 5 minutes, Dale fired 68 rounds. 49 hit. I-26 sank with her entire crew of 94, including Captain Mori. The aftermath of those 6 months fundamentally altered the Pacific War's underwater dimension. By September 1943, Japanese submarine operations in contested waters had effectively ceased. The Imperial Navy's Sixth Fleet, which commanded all submarine forces, could no longer justify sending submarines into areas patrolled by American destroyers. The mathematics were too brutal. Send 10 submarines on patrol, lose 3 or 4 to Fletcher-class destroyers, accomplish minimal damage to American forces. The equation didn't balance. The strategic implications rippled across Japanese naval planning. Submarines that should have been hunting American aircraft carriers instead ferried supplies to bypassed garrisons. Submarines that should have been interdicting American convoy routes instead conducted defensive patrols far from combat zones. The offensive submarine doctrine that Japan had developed in the 1930s collapsed under the weight of American destroyer effectiveness. Japanese submarine production continued, but purpose shifted. New submarines were designed for cargo, carrying, for special operations, for quicken suicide torpedo deployment. The aggressive fleet submarines that had attacked Pearl Harbor, Sydney Harbor, and Ceylon in 1942 became an endangered species. By 1944, Japanese submarine commanders avoided American destroyers entirely, aborting missions rather than risking detection. The Americans, meanwhile, refined their tactics further. Fletcher-class destroyers began working in pairs, with one maintaining sonar contact while the other attacked. Coordination with aircraft improved, with patrol planes directing destroyers to submarine contacts. Radar-equipped destroyers conducted night surface patrols specifically to catch submarines recharging batteries. The hunters had become extraordinarily efficient. For the destroyer crews who executed these attacks, the experience was intense but brief. Sonarman Robert Hendricks, who made the initial contact that led to I-2's destruction, later described the engagement to Navy historians. From first contact to submarine sinking was maybe 15 minutes. Felt like hours. The whole time, you're tracking this thing that's trying to kill you, knowing if you lose contact, it escapes. Then it surfaces, and the guns start firing. The noise is incredible. 5 guns firing continuously, shell casings everywhere. Then it's over. The submarine's gone. You're pulling survivors from the water, men who were trying to kill you 5 minutes ago. It's strange. The 5-inch gun crews became exceptionally proficient. Gun Captain Daniel Torres of USS Taylor described the training that made those high hit rates possible. We practiced constantly. Towed targets, shore bombardment, simulated aircraft. The gun crew became a single organism, Load, aim, fire. Load, aim, fire. When we engaged that submarine, it was just another target, except this one shot back, poorly. Their deck gun never got off a round before we destroyed the submarine. We fired 61 times, hit 47 times. I was proud of my crew. But the human cost for Japanese submariners was catastrophic. Of the 18 submarines sunk by Fletcher-class destroyers in those 6 months, only 73 crew members survived from total crews exceeding 1,500 men. The survival rate was less than 5%. Most submarines sank so quickly that crew members trapped inside had no chance to escape. Those who did escape often faced gunfire or drowning in waters far from rescue. The few survivors who were recovered provided American intelligence with valuable information about Japanese submarine capabilities and tactics. But they also carried psychological scars. Petty Officer Yoshiro Nakamura, one of 17 survivors from I-2, was interviewed after the war. The depth charges damaged our hydraulic systems. We surfaced uncontrollably. Before we could man the deck gun, shells were hitting us. The conning tower exploded. The captain died instantly. More shells hit. The pressure hull was penetrated. Water rushed in. Men were screaming. I jumped overboard. The American destroyer kept firing. Not at us in the water. At the submarine. They wanted to ensure it sank. I floated for maybe 10 minutes before they stopped firing and recovered us. 17 survived from 94. The rest died inside the submarine or drowned. The tactical revolution pioneered by those Fletcher-class destroyers influenced anti-submarine warfare for decades. The principle that aggressive surface gunfire could destroy a submarine faster and more certainly than depth charges alone became standard doctrine. Modern destroyers and frigates still carry rapid-fire guns specifically for engaging surfaced submarines. The tactic developed in 1943 remains relevant in the 21st century. For Japan, the destruction of their submarine force by American destroyers represented a strategic failure that compounded other disasters. Japanese submarines accomplished far less in World War II than their capabilities suggested they should have. They sank relatively few American warships. They failed to interdict American supply lines effectively. They were withdrawn from offensive operations and relegated to supply missions and defensive patrols. The aggressive submarine doctrine that began the war ended with submarines hiding from American destroyers. The Fletcher-class destroyers that pioneered these tactics went on to distinguished service throughout the Pacific War. Many survived to serve in the Korean War and beyond. Several were transferred to Allied navies and served into the 1980s. But their most significant contribution was those 6 months in 1943 when they demonstrated that American engineering, tactics, and crew proficiency could dominate even in warfare beneath the waves. The 5-inch gun, dismissed by Japanese planners as irrelevant to anti-submarine warfare, had proven to be the most lethal anti-submarine weapon in the Pacific, not because it could hit submerged submarines, but because it could destroy surfaced submarines so quickly and overwhelmingly that they had no chance to dive, no chance to fight, no chance to escape. The mathematics were simple and brutal. 75 rounds per minute, 60 to 80% hit rate, 55 pounds of steel and explosive per hit. No submarine could survive, and none did. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.